See the cat. Hopefully the cat won't sabotage proceedings. Okay. Right. Well, still got a couple of people waiting to come in. But Justin, I don't know if you want to go ahead and share your screen. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see that. I can. Everybody else good?
Cool.
Lovely. Just like I said, there's two people that look like they're still just out in the other, but I'll keep letting people in as we go on. I think Justin, I'll hand over to you. Justin is one of our fantastic volunteers. He's really active in sea search and has been doing a lot with the seagrass and kelp mapping as well, haven't you, Justin?
Yeah.
But tonight you'll be talking about your research, which I'm very excited to hear about. So I shall let you carry on.
Great, lovely. Thanks for the introduction, Bex. And like Bex said, I had the opportunity to I guess use the volunteering that I was doing in the St Austell Bay area and connect that to a research project, all very well timed, and it worked out quite well. And I'd like to tell you tonight a little bit about how those came together and the findings basically of that work. So the story that basically that I'd like to tell you is that seagrass is a habitat that exists within our coastal areas, and it provides a really special place. And I'll go for fish and special habitats. And what I'll tell you a little bit more about that a little bit later. But another key feature about seagrass is that it has this capacity to take on whatever is in the environment in terms of nutrients or sometimes toxic chemicals or heavy metals and stores it in the tissue and kind of tells the story about what the water quality has been like over the past few weeks and months. And so we can use that as a way to understand what the water quality is like in general over the past few weeks and months, as opposed to sort of sampling the water all the time. And that's exactly what I did. And this is that story. So just by means of what I'm going to go over tonight, let me just move over to the next slide. So I'll tell you a little bit about St Austell Bay and its seagrass meadows, what I did for the sampling and the analysis towards that, the findings of that, and possible next steps. So in 2019, Natural England released their survey information, and shown in pink over here, so St Austell Bay is outlined in black, and you see quite a fragmented approach or picture of the seagrass meadow within St Austell Bay, and this was repeated with IFCA and Cornwall Wildlife Trust in 2022. And as you can see, that the meadow is significantly larger than originally anticipated, and the methodology to do this was a little bit different. There was a boat with an echo or acoustic sounding device that not only would you be able to understand what the seagrass is, but you'd also be able to understand its density and length, which I'll show in a second. But what they found, and what's really cool about this picture, is that the seagrass meadows in St Austell Bay is about 360 hectares, which is about 500 football pitches. It's big, right? It's a really lovely big space of seagrass. And that's really cool. So some of the additional information that they were able to get from this work they did was they had a look at let me turn my pointer on. I think I can do that. Here we go. So what they were able to do was they were able to determine the length of the seagrass. So this is just a heat map giving an indication of seagrass length. So the darker colors indicate shorter, and then the lighter or the greener colors indicate longer. And then the other bit of information, like I said, was they're able to determine the density. And what you can see here typically is that sort of on the interior of the seagrass meadows, the seagrass tends to be longer and tends to be denser. So why is seagrass really special? And I think tonight if you're not a seagrass buff already, you'll probably hear a lot more about why seagrass is pretty special. But it does provide certain key factors that are really important for our coastal space. One and for me, I think this is probably one of the most important, is that it provides a really important habitat for juvenile fish, and it acts as a nursery environment for younger fish to hide and graze and feed until they're big enough to go out into the more open spaces. And a lot of these fish do have commercial value in terms of fishing stock. Um, but the other thing that seagrass can do, like I said a little bit earlier, is they can tell us what's going on in the water, like because they take on what's in the environment. They tell that story of what's being released into that water space. They help stabilize sediment. So you can imagine you've got these fronds, and what that does is it slows the water down. So you have water moving maybe ever so slightly faster above the seagrass, but the seagrass being in place slows down water movement. And what that does is it traps sediment, so it helps clarify water, but it also helps trap nutrients. Um, and there is a thought that in certain environments, it's also quite good for carbon capture. Not so much directly interacting with coastal spaces, but perhaps more in lagoons and estuaries where there's not too much sediment disturbance. And then obviously it creates a unique biodiversity hotspot. It's also a unique habitat. So we do see some threats to seagrass, obviously. So humans do threaten seagrass. We do have an anthropogenic impact on seagrass, and in particular for St Austell Bay, what we'd see is that there's two rivers that empty in and near St Austell Bay. So here we have a satellite image. Here is St Austell Bay, and highlighted in this sort of cyan color are two of the rivers. The one river is Par River, and you can see it extends quite far up towards Bodmin, Helmand Tor sort of space. And the other river is the St Austell River, also known as the White River. And as you can see, this white scarring over here is the China clay mines. And for better or for worse, these mines have been operating in Cornwall for over 2 centuries. And as part of that process, they have also used these rivers as a conduit to help remove sediment and waste from the processing sites. And unfortunately, that sediment has ended up in St Austell Bay. And interestingly, this has been going on for let's say the odd 100 years. It stopped in about the 1950s, 1970s. I think there was a better understanding of what we were doing to our environment around that time. And so they stopped using the rivers as a way to get rid of the mine waste. But there's a long and I suppose embedded history of mining in the whole of St Austell Bay. For example, one of the beaches, known as Crinus, or also known as Carlion, is made up of stent, which is a waste product of the mining process. So all that's, if you've been to Carlion Bay and you're walking on that sand, that stent, that's mine waste. So and there's other beaches. The really fine sediment is probably mine waste that's made its way down the rivers, because originally, for the most part, St Austell Bay habitats or the sediment and the environment with just sort of that generally existed before mining was thought to be sort of the shell gravel sort of environment. So you can see this like sort of pebbly, there's a little bit of merle over here. So this is not necessarily taken from St Austell Bay, but this is possibly what St Austell Bay used to look like before mining. And then just here's some pictures of this was 1970s, and this is one of the sort of the rivers at that time. As you can see, just this white sediment being released. And having met some divers that have lived in St Austell Bay all their lives, remember the days of when the bay turned white, just with this waste that would be flushed into the space. So we've had a significant impact, but it's not just St Austell Bay. I mean, humans have had a significant impact wherever they've lived on the coastal sites. And the good news is that the seagrass is there. It still is growing. And so we're just trying to understand, well, how can we improve things from here? One thing we do know is that water quality is really important for seagrass, and there's a myriad of studies. And just looking at the scientific literature, you can see that as these sort of assessments come up, all of them are sort of pointing in the direction of like water quality is really important for healthy seagrass. And there's two studies that were performed in the British Isles, this perilous state of seagrass in the British Isles, as well as the nitrogen tracking. And I'm going to reference these two studies in the work that I did because it's nice to have a benchmark to see where we sit in terms of the other sites within the UK, well, other seagrass meadow sites compared to St Austell Bay. So. First thing I had to do was determine where the discharge points are in St Austell Bay. So on these red triangles over here are the main rivers. The green shape over here is just the border of the seagrass, just to contextualize. And you can see there's a few main rivers. So the Par River, there's Polmere Stream, and then there's another stream over here, which are continuously flowing into St Austell Bay. And then there are some minor streams that, depending on the rainfall, also empty into St Austell Bay. They're in yellow on the western side here. And there's probably more of these minor streams on the western side compared to on the east over here. And then finally, and there probably are other sources, but these are the pumping stations where our wastewater when there's overflow situations get pumped into the bay. And there are several that are found within St Austell River, but there are several that pump directly from coastal sites. So, you'll have pumping sites from places like Charlestown and Porthpearn, Polkerris, and one of the ones that is probably releases quite a lot is this 1.7 kilometer pipeline that extends into the bay and has existed for quite a while. And continually releases. The unfortunate thing is if you speak to people who do the river monitoring, they have a very sad tale to tell in terms of how much waste is released from these overflow sites and that sort of thing. For example, in Luxillian, there's continuous release of waste, especially overflow. St Austell, the Menegwin site in St Austell, the chap who does the riverfly monitoring, Nick Taylor, has recorded 3 months continuous release. So of a year span, you have release continuously for 3 months. That's the sort of level of waste that's going into the rivers, which is entering our marine space. So we know where the sites are, and that kind of helped guide us as to where we're going to sample seagrass from. So just in terms of the methods of what I did, so I picked 14 different sites at a depth where I could snorkel and sort of duck dive down and collect samples. And they were spanning across basically nearly all the accessible parts of St Austell Bay. Once you start getting to the eastern side here, there's a lot of sheer drop cliffs, which makes it quite difficult to access unless you have support or with kayak and that sort of thing. And so it was I stuck to the sites where I was could access it relatively easy. So for each of the sites, I went and collected 2 fronds or 2 blades or 2 shoots of seagrass per site. And basically, when I processed the samples, what I did was I measured the length of the seagrass, the width of the blade, and as you can see, there is some sort of mucky red stuff, and these are epiphytes. So these are typically algae that grow on the surface of seagrass, and they can, not always, but they can reflect the state of the water also not being so great. So typically the more epiphytes you have, the more nutrient loading there is in the water for those epiphytes to benefit from. Why that's not so good for seagrass is because they occlude light. And so because seagrass needs to photosynthesize, you have this competition basically from these things growing on the surface of the seagrass, and that's not so good for seagrass. So I measured the length of the seagrass as well as the width, and then scraped off these epiphytes, dried them, and then measured them in terms of weight. I also dried the seagrass, as you can see. So that's the seagrass was dried at 60 degrees. I then pounded that with a pestle and mortar, and then that was ready for mass spectroscopy. Mass spectroscopy is a way of measuring atoms. And I'll go into a little bit more detail a bit later, just explaining why that's important in the work in this particular work. So jumping back to the other things that were part of the study was also understanding the historical water quality. So what records do we have of the water quality, particularly when it comes to nutrients? And then current water quality. And Oscar Miller from the Wildlife Trust was kindly supplied that information. He did the water quality monitoring of the smaller streams and the larger rivers. I think Chloe helped him every now and again, and provided that information. So we had a historical as well as a current look and understanding of what was going on and being released into St Austell Bay. So in terms of water quality, before I go into that, let me just sort of touch on when we talk about nutrients, what does that mean? So there's the water environment regulations, which were formerly called the Water Framework Directive. After Brexit, we changed the name. Basically, we're looking at two main sources of nutrients, and the one occurs in your nitrogen-based nutrients, which would be your ammonium ions, the nitrates and nitrites. And within the regulations, there's no defined threshold for fresh water. So for marine, we don't necessarily have thresholds. But for fresh water, we don't have a defined threshold as to what is good or what is bad for nitrates. For phosphates, on the other hand, we do. So within these regulations and sort of frameworks, anything above 0.12 milligrams per liter is considered of poor ecological status. So if a river has this amount of anything above 0.12 milligrams per liter, it's considered poor ecological status. So when we start looking at the historical information of water quality in the Par River, as you can see, there are elevated levels of nitrates. What that means in terms of regulation, we can't really say, but we do see this typical temperate river or temperate environmental system behavior of nitrates sort of dipping off in the summer months and then surging in the winter again. However, when we look at the phosphates, if this red line indicates 0.12 milligrams per liter, you can see that over a period of 2020 to 2025, on average, the water quality of the Par River is of poor ecological status, and that is very obvious in the summer months as well as in the winter months. If we look at other factors, now again, this doesn't necessarily mean that the water quality in the bay itself is going to be poor. You know, you're going to see effects of dilution going into the marine space and that sort of thing. So we don't necessarily have a handle on what the water quality is exactly in the marine space, but we know that the stuff that's going into the bay is of poor quality. If we look at other factors, proxies perhaps, that tell us more of a story. So here we're looking at coliforms. Coliforms are bacteria that live in our gut. And in this particular case, it's coliforms that live in the gut of cows as well as humans. And we can measure that. We have techniques of measuring how many there are in a certain volume of water. And again, as a proxy, there are standards. So we don't want any more than 1,000 of these types of bacteria per 100 ml of water. Anything above that is poor bathing quality. So if you're going to swim in that river, that freshwater river, anything above 1,000 tells you that the water quality is bad. And as you can see, from 2022 to 2025, over and over again, during the bathing season, if you had to swim in Par River, that's pretty manky. You wouldn't want to swim in Par River. And so we know that these coliforms, and coliforms basically indicate feces. So we know that you know there is waste being released, and this could come from farming practices, but it also could come from wastewater. This particular assay or the test that was done here doesn't necessarily allow us to understand or define that. The other little stream right next to Par, it's also continuously flowing, but not as strongly. As you can see, there's coliform events that can and which are indicative of waste, which is indicative of nutrients. We don't have a complete data set in terms of nutrients for the Palmyra stream, but we have something a little bit more consistent in terms of coliform count. And you can see sometimes it's up to 30 times higher than sort of the poor bathing quality status. So there are events, you know, where you're having these really sort of nasty, you know, gut bacteria and feces entering Par, very near Par Beach. So if we, and this slide I've put in for shock value. I admit it, it's a shock value slide. St Austell River in the winter, you know, sometimes the levels are 100 times higher than the threshold for poor water bathing quality status. It's pretty awful. I know people don't necessarily use the water that much in the winter, but there are water users. There are people that swim throughout the year, and this is what's being released into our coastal systems. And this is, in the past 2 years basically. So it's pretty shocking actually. Right. But moving on. So if we start looking at the more current data, if we start looking at the information that Oscar gathered for us, and so thanks to lovely Oscar, and I've colored this sort of in the green, black, and red just to give you an idea of the positioning. And so you have again we have our nitrates being measured, or our nitrogen sources being measured, and again we see them elevated. If we look at the threshold for phosphates, for the most part, we know PAR has elevated levels of phosphates. We've seen that before. A few of the other streams also have that elevated. But what I want to highlight here is that there's one stream, the Trinaran stream, which releases near the Ropehaven Reserve or on Silver Mines Beach, if you're familiar with that, has a really, really elevated level of nitrate, unusually high. And this is it stands out quite a bit, and it was quite a surprising find actually. And I'll come to this a little bit later in the talk, but just if you remember, Trinaran stream has high levels of nitrates and what they could possibly mean. Right, so moving on from water quality, we start looking at the seagrass itself. So we know the water going into the bay contains high levels of nutrients. It's overloaded with nutrients as well as fecal matter, basically. This I realize is a busy slide, so I'll explain. So anything in color, so on if it's whether it's red or amber or green, those were from those previous studies I spoke about that I'd make reference to. So we have all these sites across the British Isles, and this is and basically comparing the surface area of the longest blade of seagrass that I was able to harvest and collect versus other sites across the British Isles. And you can see there's very, very short seagrass, which is the red also indicates health or quality. And you can see these samples over here were of poor quality. Isles of Scilly is considered the gold standard for the British Isles. And you can see compared to everywhere else that has been sort of sampled so far, it stands out. It's actually having really sort of healthy seagrass, lovely, long, big, wide, long strands of seagrass. St Austell Bay kind of sits in the middle. So if I had to combine sites 1 to 14 and get an amalgamate answer for that, it's in the middle. It's okay. It's of intermediate length and width. For those of you who know, I realize that there's a story to be told in the length and the width of seagrass, but this is sort of a blunt measure of giving us an idea of, on average, at that snorkelable depth where I was collecting, what the seagrass looked like. And it might look healthier, it might look better, longer, wider at the deeper parts. Perhaps, those keen divers of you out there that would like to engage in something like this, you might be able to find healthier seagrass at the deeper points. So once I had the morphometrics or the measurements of the seagrass, the other thing naturally to check was what are the nutrients doing? What's the contents of the seagrass? And here's there's a golden triad of nutrients that we can measure. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon can be measured in seagrass using mass spectroscopy, which I spoke about a little bit earlier. And when you start comparing the ratios of carbon to nitrogen, nitrogen to phosphorus, and carbon to phosphorus, it gives you slight indicators of what's going on. So if you compare carbon to nitrogen, it kind of gives you an idea of sort of the amount of available light to seagrass. Not always, but it's a general indicator for that. If you compare the levels of nitrogen and phosphorus, which are typically associated with nutrients, you can actually see if there's a deficit or if there's an excess of one or the other. And if you compare carbon to phosphorus, you can definitely tell there's a ratio within plants that's generally considered healthy, and anything above or below will tell you there's an excess. In my research, unfortunately, I was unable I didn't have enough funding to measure the phosphorus, but I did measure nitrogen and carbon levels and had an idea thus of light availability. And for the most part, we can see that the light availability is okay. So how do we know that? So anything below 14, this ratio over here, so in other words, under this orange line is insufficient. Anything below 20 and between 14 is intermediate, and then anything above is adequate and sufficient amounts of light. And for the most part, where I sampled the seagrass, anywhere between 3 to 8 meters of depth, the seagrass was receiving enough light. So the seagrass at that height, depth, sorry, had enough light. There's a slight dip here, but these were sampled at 8 meters of depth. So it possibly could reflect that there's, you're just starting to lose light at about 8 meters. Okay, so before I tell you a little bit about the rest of the story, I want to talk a little bit about isotopes. So isotopes are naturally occurring versions of atoms. When we talk about, I don't know, there's a big thing about sort of the uranium at the moment that's being purified in certain parts of the world, and there's light versions, heavy versions, and the same thing exists for things like nitrogen. So nitrogen can exist in a state called 14, let's call it that, and a state called 15. And when it's in a state called 14, the nucleus of the atom has 7 protons and 7 neutrons. And when it's in the state of 15, it has 7 protons and 8 neutrons. So from an atomic point of view, it's the 15 is ever so slightly heavier, ever so slightly heavier. But if you use mass spectroscopy, which once you've purified all your atoms and you turn them into gas and you channel them through a really special strong magnet, it has enough strength to separate out the light and the heavy nitrogen from each other. And the light one hits the sensor and the heavy one hits the sensor. And that gives us an idea of a ratio. Why is that important? Because 15N is typically enriched in biological material. It's enriched in flesh, it's enriched in tissue, it's enriched in waste, in feces. So the more of the 15N is present in seagrass, the more we know that there's a source of, or a pollutant or a nutrient overloading. Typically, your 14N is atmospheric nitrogen, and this is the predominance of nitrogen in the atmosphere. This makes up a tiny amount, and so the more of this there is in the seagrass, it kind of gives us an idea. It gives us an indication of how overloaded the system is. So when we look at those numbers, when we compare those ratios. Again, all these sites over here on opposite sides or either sides of the St Austell Bay are other British Isle sites. And again, you can see the Isles of Scilly is our golden standard. You can see it has the lowest ratio, which is exactly what you want. Whereas Southend-on-Sea, if you know where that is, will tell the story. And that's probably in the worst. It has the highest amount of 15N within the seagrass tissue. St Austell Bay sits in the middle, somewhere in the middle. So it's of intermediate sort of levels compared to the rest of the British Isles. Is that good? Probably not. We could do better. We could do Isles of Scilly better, basically. So, the quality of the water, we know there's junk. We know there's rubbish going there's higher levels of nutrients going into the bay. We can do better, and that will be reflected in the seagrass. If we break it down by site, and this is where things get a little bit interesting. So again, this is site 1 to 14, the different sampling sites, and you can see roughly there's a ratio of 7.5 per mil of this 15N in the seagrass. And what I was expecting was, by the main rivers, by Par River, where you have a huge amount, a big water volume coming in with this loaded with nutrients, is going to have the highest levels of 15N in the seagrass, and it's not. It seems to be fairly evenly distributed across the entire bay, which is kind of weird. So there's some theories that I have around this. One is that the streams that are releasing nutrients into the bay have high enough levels of these nutrients in order to sort of push the levels of 15N up in the seagrass at the depth where I sampled. Another one is that we do experience tidal streaming in the channel. So the water will travel in one direction, depending on the tide, and then it'll travel in the other direction when the tide changes, and that will have an impact on how the water mixes in the bay. And so what you might be seeing here is actually that the water is just mixing back and forth, distributing those nutrients over the seagrass. Another possibility is that we're experiencing like an embayment effect. So because it's a bay, it traps the water more than it would at a sort of let's call it a flat coastline, for example, where the water can just sort of flush past. Whereas here, the water sort of struggles, it eddies in the space, and so you end up trapping the nutrients. So those are the possibilities. And one really unusual thing. Now I'm going to talk about Trinaran just very quickly. Bex, I realize I'm short on time. I apologize. So this site over here is really far away from the major polluting sites, except it's not. It's close to Trinaran, and we see that in the seagrass. And if we look at the seagrass, and this is a picture of the seagrass at Trinaran. It's lovely and thick and long. The fronds, the blades are a meter long. It's dense, and if you look at the epiphytes, the things growing on the seagrass in the space, in the center of this meadow is almost nothing. But as soon as you go to the periphery, it's slimy, it's goopy. There's things growing on the sediment. There's things growing on the seagrass, indicative of high nutrients in that space. And the reason why it's probably not growing in the center, I have a theory. I might be wrong, but I suspect that it might be because the density of the seagrass promotes biodiversity. And so you have little fish, little snails, little sea critters helping to eat the epiphytes off the seagrass and keeping it clean. I might be wrong, but there is some literature to support the idea that, more dense seagrass has a way of maintaining itself with what it hosts. In other sites, as you can see, this is a Porthpian. This last year, 2025, was a particularly bad year for this sort of red fluffy algae that was growing on the seagrass. A lot of people commented on it, but unusually, it's not consistent across the bay. So this graph over here is site 1 to 14, and you can see after Charlestown, roughly after this point here, the epiphytes tend to tail off, and it might be because there's more wave action. So typically, the waves are coming in from the west and they're traveling eastward. And so actually this side of the coast gets most of the wave action or the wave energy. And that might not be so good for these epiphytes to hang on with. It's not entirely clear to me why they're not around on those fronds of seagrass. Right. So to summarize, this is the first of its kind study that's been performed in St Austell. We were able to look at water quality, the morphometrics, in other words, the size of the seagrass, as well as the elemental composition. We do see spatial variability. In other words, depending on where you are in the bay, it's going to obviously impact what the seagrass looks like, what's growing on the seagrass, the elemental composition, the length of the seagrass. So it does kind of indicate you sort of may even have these microhabitats within the bay, which makes sense because it's about 5 kilometers, I think, in perimeter. There is definitely isotopic evidence. So the light availability where I collected was fine. So that's a thing of thinking about, oh, maybe there's a bit of sediment, really fine sediment from the mining is still being churned up and blocking out the light, or it seems to be okay. The seagrass at that level where I was collecting seemed to be all right. There's definite evidence that the nutrient levels are elevated in St Austell Bay. We know that the river sources, the freshwater river sources, are bringing in loads of nutrients, and we see it in the seagrass. This is evidence. So often, if you go to sort of regulators or whatever the case is and say, well, look, there's a whole bunch of nutrients in the water. If they say, well, so what? What impact is it having? Here you go. Here's your answer. It's being collected in the seagrass. The seagrass is holding those nutrients, and we know now that it's having an impact on the environment. So some future research, if anyone out there is interested, there's scope to look at the phosphorus levels. There's scope to look at things like chlorophyll levels, in other words, floating algae or single cells that also benefit from nutrient overloading. Things like turbidity is another interesting thing to measure. And then also, if any of you are interested in looking at meadow biodiversity, what are in our meadows? That's another really important study that we don't really appreciate yet. I'm going to, in terms of time, I'm just going to leave it at that. So just a thank you slide to my funders, Sea Changes, and to everybody else from Cornwall Wildlife Trust. Thank you so much. Everyone's been really supportive, and it's been a really exciting and fun project.
Oh, thank you, Justin. That's really fascinating. A little more like a PhD project to me in itself than a master's study, to be honest. So in depth. But I'm sure you've got lots of questions yourself you'd be loving to follow up on that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure there's probably quite a lot of questions as well that people have for you, but if you bear with us, save them for the end, if you're happy with that as well, Justin. And we will hand over now to Nia, who's managed to get out of her traffic nightmare, thankfully. So Nia's one of our Seagrass project officers, so she's going to be, some of you will have known her. I think we've probably got a few volunteers online. But she'll be talking about the work of the Intertidal Seagrass Project and some of the fantastic stuff they've been doing. So I'll hand over to Nia. You might.
Sorry, think I'm accidentally going in and out of my pages. I'll try and share that once more and hopefully get going.
It's always a nightmare switching from Teams to Zoom and Zoom to Teams. Everything's
Yeah,
in
yeah.
slightly different places.
Didn't realize once you share your screen, you can't see anything or click any buttons. So I'll try again.
It's a bit off-putting, yeah.
Right, here we go. Cool. Is that working for you guys?
Yeah, that looks
Perfect.
good to me. Can anybody else see okay? Brilliant. All
Cool.
right, I'll
Yeah,
mute myself. Hand over.
amazing. Yeah, sorry everyone for being late, but here now, and yeah, managed to catch most of Justin's talk, which was really interesting and good to hear. So I'm going to chat to you guys a little bit more about our seagrass project at the Wildlife Trust, particularly on intertidal seagrass called Seeding Change Together. Yeah, so I'm aware Justin kind of touched on some of the reasons why seagrass is so amazing and kind of the pressures and things, but I thought I'd kind of reiterate the importance of like what I feel are the three main kind of factors, one of which being biodiversity, kind of both all types of seagrass host a whole range of animals that they support themselves. So you've got like stalk jellyfish, you've got these seahorses, you've got snake-like anemones, you've got loads of animals that like live on the seagrass, and it's like creates this whole habitat which is incredible. But you also have the seagrass creates like a juvenile nursery for these species that come and go in their kind of early years, and this is really good for kind of commercial fisheries and those species and kind of our commercial fisheries and how incredible they are. So it's that in itself is a really good point, but also we've got this kind of carbon sequestration side of things. And we often say seagrass is amazing for carbon sequestration, but we don't talk about why so much. And so I thought I'd kind of explain that in a bit more detail. So seagrass and like its long kind of leaves manage to kind of slow down the water movement. And this allows sediment in the water to start to kind of just settle down onto the seabed. This is where the kind of the seagrass roots and rhizomes come in, and they're able to kind of stabilize this sediment and hold it down. And see, inside sediment, once it's all kind of compacted, you create an anoxic environment. So this means there's no oxygen in there. So kind of breakdown and bacteria and things like that, whereas naturally things would start to rot and the carbon would be redistributed. This doesn't happen in an anoxic environment. And so this is why I think Justin kind of mentioned that it's good in some environments, not in others. And we'll kind of touch on this further down in the presentation, how we work on muddy sediments. And mud is much finer, much denser, and much more compact, and it's really good for this carbon sequestration, whereas sand and gravel, because it's so loose and moves around so much, isn't so good. But yes, you have this kind of carbon sequestration factor, but you also have this element of kind of like human engagement and personal happiness and the ability to interact with this environment and kind of educate each other and share these experiences. And experiences are really, really important for kind of interacting with the natural environment and then kind of feeling motivated to take actions to protect it. So they not only have these kind of critical kind of carbon and biodiversity factors, but also this ability to bring more people into the world of marine conservation and how we can kind of go ahead and protect these places. But there's also, so back in the 1930s, there was a big outbreak of wasting disease, which actually just killed off about 90% of seagrass in the UK. And so we've had this massive loss, and like there's been some recovery, which is great, but threats and pressures, as you can see kind of down the bottom of the slide, have kind of hindered that improvement. So things like kind of coastal development, human interactions, got pollution, like all the, like Justin was also saying about the water pollution, All these things are kind of hindering the ability for seagrass to regenerate and grow back. And this is kind of where our project comes in and other seagrass restoration projects, in that we've had this massive dieback, and it might feel like in Cornwall we have loads of seagrass because we're really, really lucky. It feels like we've got it everywhere, but we are quite niche and we are very special for that. So it's kind of protecting and restoring this amazing habitat so it can do its thing into the future. So in the Wildlife Trust, our seagrass team is made up of 3 of us. Matt Slater, I'm sure some of you know, is the Marine Conservation Officer, and he kind of oversees the project. Got Chloe James, who I think is in the call as well. She runs the project and manages it. And so, yeah, she's a seagrass project officer. And then I am the seagrass assistant officer. And I only joined back end of July. So I've done one restoration season so far, which has been amazing. So in the UK, we have 2 different species of seagrass. Zostera marina is mostly what you kind of are familiar with. It's in most of the pictures. It's this nice, luscious, long seagrass that exists subtidally. So that's below the water. It's not normally ever exposed unless on a really, really a low spring tide or something. So this is what you'll generally snorkel over and dive over. And it's, yeah, what everyone likes to put, a postcard kind of type of seagrass. And traditionally, in kind of your generic intertidal seagrass, then is Zostera noltai. And by intertidal, I mean areas where the tide it gets fully exposed when the tide goes out. And so this is quite a harsh environment to be living in. So Zostera noltai is kind of a much smaller version of seagrass. The main difference we have for like telling them apart is using where the seeds grow. So on Zostera marina, the seeds grow on like a reproductive shoot that produces in like excess of all of its leaves. Whereas noltai produces these tiny little pods at the very base of the plant, which then the leaves are above. So yeah, they both have their kind of niches in that form. But actually, there is also a version of Zostera marina that has now been growing intertidally, just to confuse things. And this is what we're now working with in our project is, yeah, we call it intertidal marina. And in this picture at the bottom, you can actually see marina and noltai together. So you can tell the difference. Noltai is kind of a bit finer, but yeah, it's kind of really cool that we've now got like this hybridized, well, not, it's exactly the same species, but yeah, that it's growing intertidally, which is really cool. So kind of going back to the beginning of the project, so the project is now 4 years old, or maybe we're even into our 5th year. And it all started when seagrass was discovered on our Foul Ruin Nature Reserve, which is one of the Wildlife Trust nature reserves, back in 2021, I believe. And so this is what the seagrass meadow, an intertidal seagrass meadow, looks like when the tide is out, which was an amazing discovery. And the bed was actually doing quite well. And the Environment Agency was surveying the bed every year and found that it was actually naturally expanding, which was really, really cool. But there was kind of plans here to kind of help restore it and kind of, help that expansion. And so Sophie and Matt, Sophie was the project officer at the beginning of the project, kind of started working on the site. And one of the biggest issues you have with working in the areas we do high up in the estuaries is the mud. And as you can kind of see from the photos here, like if you just walk along the mud in your wellies, it's actually really dangerous. You can kind of sink, and it's, you're in an environment anyway where the tide can come in really fast. And also the impact you're having. So as we talked about with the carbon is kind of trapped inside the sediment. And when you disturb the sediment, you're then potentially exposing that carbon to be re-emitted into the atmosphere. So this is kind of to be avoided. So the first prototype of how to even be on the mud to even think about restoration was these wooden squares, which Matt and Sophie kind of put together. And I was actually volunteering on the project at the time and got to trial these out. And it was better than wellies, but definitely very much dependent on how good you were at knots and how hard you could tie these planks of wood to your feet on how much success you had. But you can easily see from the photo that much, much less impact. But actually then, and we use these now, came across mud shoes. Well, we call them snowshoes, but we call them mud shoes. And these are just the lifesavers. So they spread your impact. They're designed for that. And they're really well kind of like strapped onto your feet. So this allows us to walk on the mud and be in the environment so we can even be thinking about restoration. But when you're working on the seagrass, you really don't want to be walking over it and disturbing it. And this is where Matt kind of came up with this idea of the bodyboard train. And again, this is really, really helpful. This is kind of how we do most of our work throughout the year when we're on the seagrass meadows. And it's a really fun team building exercise. Realistically, we're all on our bodyboards and we have to pass them from the back to the front. to work our way out across the seagrass meadow, and then we can kneel on them and use them to then look for seeds and pick them up. So this is kind of like, yeah, how we are going about our seagrass restoration from a kind of practical point of view. And this was all developed quite early on. And then when it comes to like the actual methods of restoring the seagrass, again, they trialed quite a few methods in these first 2 years at the Foul Ruin site, one of which was the Hessian bags. This is like, Hessian is a material that lots of other conservation, like seagrass restoration projects were using around the time. And it's this idea that you make kind of, you get some mud from the estuary, you put some seeds in it or mix it around, put it in the Hessian bags, and then you plant the Hessian bags like you would a bulb. Yeah, and then another one they trialed was this kind of injection way of planting, kind of using a corking gun style, and making a mud mix with the seeds and the mud and injecting it into the ground. And the third trial was through cores. So this is kind of one of the easiest and like most successful way of doing restoration, in that you can quite literally just take seagrass and move it and plant it somewhere else. You don't have to do any seed collection. It's just, yeah, literally just moving them around. But the downside of this is you can't move it from one site to another. So whereas with our seeds, we can collect from one site. For example, at the moment we're doing Tor Point down the Tamar, and you can take them to other places in Cornwall, as long as you've worked around biosecurity and made sure everything is very safe. But with cores, because there's so much in the mud that you can't control on the leaves, you really can only expand a bed rather than restore a brand new bed. So in this kind of first few years of success, there was some really good and promising results. So the Hessian bags had an original success rate of around 20%, and the average leaf length was in line with the existing bed. So there didn't seem to be like a lack of growth or anything like that. Again, within 2 months of the transplants being done, the cores had expanded by 84%. So this was really, really good success and really promising for the project. However, within the summer, this is what the beds started to look like, and this is what they look like now, which is really, really sad. It's a real shame. And this is all algae growth. And kind of, so as the tide comes in, it can bring these algae mats in, and if they kind of sit there and then stay, and then the tide goes out, they can smother the seagrass and create, like I was saying, this anoxic environment. So that's what this top left picture is. It's gone all black because it's ultimately just starved of oxygen and is just rotting the seagrass underneath. And this is, there's multiple reasons for this. We have no evidence to say what exactly it is, but there's a lot of agricultural land around the site, and agricultural runoff can increase, and also pollution from sewage and things like that can increase the amount of nutrients that are in the water, and that promotes algae growth. And so you get these huge, like big growth of algae in the summer, which is proving a real problem for the seagrass restoration. So we've now had to rethink this site, and the seagrass quality is actually kind of become so low that we can't be taking seeds from it. We can't be doing active restoration. So we've had to kind of change tack a bit. And this is where we moved over to collecting seeds from on the Tamar at Banks Park and Tor Point. So in the last 10 years, a seagrass meadow of Zostera marina. So this is what I was saying about, we have Nultai was what was on the Ardevra site, and then we found that there's a huge bed of Zostera marina, but intertidally over in Tor Point. And this has only been there for about 10 years. We've spoken to some locals, and they say they can remember when it was just mud and just the seagrass has just grown and done really, really well. The beds here are really dense, and they produce a lot of seed, which is amazing. We're not entirely sure why, but it's just, suddenly come out of nowhere. And so we've given our heads up that this bed was here. And so if you went down, check it out. And since then, this has been our donor bed for the seeds. And Chloe's used it the last year, and then we've used it this year as well. And so we were collecting seeds from the Tamar, as you see on the map, and then storing them at the yacht harbour there. So they get stored in a container, and this is to allow so we pick them in pods. I guess I should start from the beginning. We put them in pods, and then they need to go into the container to let the pods rot down and release the seeds. Once the seeds are released, then we can think about planting them out onto the new sites. And so we have this container that was donated to us from the lobster hatchery, and this is where we hold the seeds. They rot seeds, and they rot down for about a month to 2 months. while we continue the rest of our season of collecting. We put them inside these mesh bags that we get from Aldi in the fruit and veg section. I'm sure you've seen them, but they're a really good kind of grain to hold the seeds. And so, yeah, they go inside in the bags, into the container, and then we let them sit there and rot down. And in 2024, we then planted them onto a new site at Calamansack on the Helford. There's actually historical records of seagrass originally growing here. So the idea was to kind of replant seagrass where it had historically grown, to have that idea of properly restoring a bed. And it was all looking really good. Over 100 of the seedlings came up. Chloe will shoot me for not knowing the exact number, but there was really positive success, which is amazing. But sadly, once again, the algae was the downfall to this site. Unexpectedly, again in the summer, the algae just smothered the site, and I think within a month of the seedlings growing, they had all disappeared bar one. And so again, this is kind of a real big turning point for the project of realizing that we need to be really careful on site choice and also think more about what the issues are that are causing this. So this year, and I joined, like I said, in the July, we changed tack again, sticking with Tor Point, but choosing 2 new sites, which we recce'd in the summer, that we, fingers crossed, hope don't have algae growth this year. And so as explained, yeah, we're picking the seeds in Tor Point, and then we were actually storing them in Falmouth this year in the same container with the same method. But this was so that we could work with Falmouth Marine Conservation Group, who became our seed sitters. And this was really, really cool and a really nice way to get more people involved in the project, and also to collaborate with the marine group there. And so every week we'd run seed sorting sessions, which is where we get out some of the bags, clean them, go through the seeds, check the quality and check that everything's just going well. Because you have the issue of sometimes you can get fungi growth on the seeds, which is not so great and kind of makes them unviable. So if we have seed drop off from that, then it reduces the number of seeds that we can plant. So this was a really important part of the process, and we're really thankful to all the help that they could put into the project. And so, like I said, we then moved on to planting these seeds on the Helford and the Foy estuaries. Yeah, and we also used multiple seed collection methods this year. So we did our traditional bodyboards on the mud, which was really cool, but also we're able to offer some snorkeling sessions with some of the Sea Search snorkelers, and also from the Seagrass Action and Kelp group, to collect seagrass seeds that way. And we also did drift seagrass collection. And this is where, when it's slightly stormy, or when there's a bit of tidal movement, it can wash some of the seagrass up onto the shoreline. And this is, then we can walk along, and it's a much more accessible way of just kind of collecting the washed up seagrass and going through it for the seeds. We're a bit debatable on kind of how viable the seeds are from this process. Obviously, if they've been washed up and they've been on the shore for a really long time, we can't tell that when we're walking along sometimes. So there's, a questionable there, but it's definitely a really good way of collecting the seeds. This is us doing the seed sitting. Again, like I said, it's a really lovely social activity. We can just sit down on the harbour front and sort through them, have a good chat about everything seagrass and all that. So, yeah. Oh, and this is kind of what the seeds look like. It's hard to tell from scale there, but they are absolutely tiny. Yeah. And then this is the Foy site. So this is up by St Winnow. This is a really nice kind of open area of mud. We took 9 volunteers with us for a couple of hours of planting. And the technique we kind of use is we sieve the mud and then mix it with the seeds, put it into these mortar guns that the team have got, which are really, really cool. And then we inject them into quadrats to make sure that we're kind of giving an equal spread of seeds throughout kind of a transect, so a long strip of the mud. And on this site, we planted 9,000 seeds across 3 plots, which are both 40 meters long. And then this is our Budok Veen site. This is on the Helford. And again, we did the same methodology, took out a team of 9 volunteers and planted 6,000 seeds on this one across 2 plots. I mean, and it's also important to note here that we collected a total of 30,000 seeds altogether. But all projects have, and us included, have this kind of drop-off of viable seeds between collection and going out to plant. And so we ended up with about 15,000 seeds from our 32,000 that we were able to plant, which we feel was pretty good going. Other things we've also been up to is searching for new sites. Mostly Chloe's been doing all of these, actually. This was before my time. But yeah, heading out and searching for new sites where either there is existing seagrass or that there is potential for seagrass restoration. And Chloe's been really busy kind of, finding the two new seagrass sites where there's existing seagrass, which is really cool. We're excited to kind of explore those more this year. Isotope analysis as well, and water quality, and then also heading out with the Environment Agency on their survey days, which equally, I'll admit, is all Chloe's work, and she's been doing some really cool stuff. I also wanted to mention at this point that the Seagrass Action for Seagrass and Kelp group are an opportunity for more people to get involved. You can come volunteer with us, but you can also volunteer with them. They're always looking for people to come snorkeling. And their methodology is to take marker buoys with GPS Garmin's in them and a camera, and they're kind of synced up on time so that you can swim along, and every kind of 10 to 20 spin kicks, you take a photo, and then they're able to create these really cool maps, which map out where there's seagrass and where there isn't, and they're also doing kelp as well, based on the photos. So, and this is really helping also with other projects where like kind of people like Natural England are also starting to map seagrass and things like that. So it's really, really helpful and a really fun way to get involved. But yeah, just kind of wanted to shout out to that. And then I believe I've got a short video on our kind of seagrass restoration year this year. So hopefully it'll work with sound, but Bex, shout out to me if you don't hear anything.
Imagine swimming over swaying meadows of green that are hidden beneath the waves. But here, on the muddy edge of our coastline, another species of seagrass grows. In the intertidal zone, exposed periodically by the tides, this seagrass creates a habitat that stores carbon, stabilizes mud, and creates a feeding ground for a whole host of animals. It supports life both above and below the waterline, linking land and sea in a way that very few other habitats can. So through Seeding Change Together, Cornwall Wildlife Trust and Sea Salt are working to restore this amazing habitat. The first steps towards doing so involve collecting seeds with our amazing team of volunteers.
Hi, I'm Amy, and we're here with Cornwall Wildlife Trust to collect seeds for seagrass restoration. It's been really fun so far. We've been scavenging along the seashore to collect seagrass, and then we're looking for the tiny little seeds within the seagrass blade, which we can grow to restore seagrass beds across Cornwall. We're just back from going out on the mud to collect more seagrass seeds, and it was loads of fun. We got very muddy, and it was quite hard work. But there's a great process for making sure that we don't disturb the mud, as the seagrass has stored loads of lovely carbon from the atmosphere down into the mud. And if you put big footprints in it, then it can release that back in the atmosphere, as well as break the seagrass itself. So we worked in a team to make sure we laid out a series of bodyboards, which we walked along in our mud shoes. And then you lie down on the bodyboard and search for those seagrass seeds in amongst the bed of seagrass now the tide has gone out. And it was quite hard getting your eye in at first, but we managed to collect about 1,400 seagrass seeds, which will be restored here in Cornwall. The seeds that we have collected today will be involved in vitally important restoration projects around Cornwall. And who knows, maybe in a decade's time, I can come back and snorkel amongst thriving seagrass beds that I know I've contributed a tiny little part to.
Hi, my name's Grace, and I've been volunteering on the Seagrass project. After picking, the seeds were stored in mesh bags under a pontoon in Falmouth. This was to allow the seed pods to naturally rot away and release the seeds. So I was part of the volunteer group of seed sitters, where each session we would lift and clean the containers and sort through the mesh bags. We then emptied the bags into containers, sorted through and counted the seeds ready for planting.
Been out here today planting seagrass. We started by wading out into the estuary at low tides to collect buckets of mud, which we then brought back to shore to sieve to make this mud quite fine, to stop it clogging up the planting guns when they were filled. We then added the seagrass seeds to this mud and loaded it into the planting guns and then headed back out onto the estuary to plant them into the ground. So we planted these seeds along transects using quadrats to standardise the amount of seeds per metre squared, and they are injected directly into the mud. It was super muddy work in some challenging conditions, but it was a lot of fun and everybody was willing to get stuck in. I think we're all really looking forward to coming back in the spring to see how these little seedlings are getting on.
We've just come to the end of season 2025 and finished our final planting day today, and it has been incredible. We've had 450 volunteer hours in less than 4 months, and we are just scratching the surface of the amount of volunteers that we can get involved. But it's been overwhelming, the passion and motivation we've had from each individual from all backgrounds. We really want to say a massive thank you to you all. We couldn't have done it without you.
Yeah, that's me done.
Oh, thank you, Nia. That's brilliant. I don't think I've seen the film all the way through either. That's really nice. It was a little bit jerky on the playback, so I think what we'll do when we send the link out to the talk, we can send the link for the film as well, and then if people want to watch it through, they might appreciate it because it is beautifully done. I think your partner did a lot of the cinematography, didn't he? So
Yeah,
really nicely put together.
No, and I guess if anyone, it's kind of an ad for if you want to come and join us this restoration year, then please do look out on the website for our Seagrass events and also on Assemble. We're always looking for volunteers to get out with us. We're kind of really reliant and very appreciative of all of our volunteer work. So yeah.
I haven't got very many questions in the chat at the moment. There was just one from I'll start reading through. I think there's a few more popping in now, but we did have one from, sorry if I've got this wrong, is it Iwona, who was just asking about, like, basically, are we interfering a bit? So if we're putting hessian into the mud, could that maybe stimulate algal growth? I've answered in the chat to say I think that it's so much a bigger problem because what we're actually doing with the pilot study with the hessian bags is such a small thing, isn't it? It's like a handful of those just to sort of trial it out. Whereas this is, over a big area. And actually across Cornwall, last year we did see algal blooms on all sorts of beaches and surfaces. So we also had a problem with an algal growth in the mearl beds off St Mawes banks. I don't know if anybody saw Newquay Boating Lake last early summer. It was like a lawn. It was just bright green, and it really was a perfect storm. I mean, as you're probably all aware, we have this problem with basically nutrient pollution. Not just a Cornish problem. It's a problem for our entire country. But you get that, and then you get those conditions. Do you remember the sun? Do you remember the sun? Seeming a long way away at the moment. We had a beautiful spring and early summer. So we had calm weather, lots of light, warmth. Add that to nutrients and it's just perfect for algae. It just grows so quickly and can take advantage of that. So it was it wasn't just limited to foul ruin, but we did see a particularly bad outgrowth there on our seagrass, which is quite sad to see. Let's hope it, we're just waiting now, I guess, to have a look at it this season to see how it's looking.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. And we did actually go down to the Budok Veen site on Tuesday, and Chloe's been down to the Foy today. So I'm not sure how the Foy one went, but there was a bit of algae growth on Budok Veen, which is interesting. But hopefully it won't be a problem for us.
Yeah, okay.
I'll vouch for the Foy and just say that we didn't have any algal growth, which is really positive. But no emergency yet, but it is still quite early in the season. Last year, when we saw the growth at Kalamansak, that was in late April. So we've got time yet, but keeping a close eye.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed we get a lot more emergence and seedlings sticking around.
Yeah, it's just an anxious time for you guys now, isn't it?
It really is.
Waiting. So Kathleen said she presumes there isn't a place to commercially buy seagrass seeds. Now that would make your life a lot easier, wouldn't it? So I'm
It
guessing
would.
the answer to that is no.
Not yet, and there are quite a few initiatives and restoration projects across the UK, and just from experience of all the hard work that goes into handpicking these seeds, we're all quite protective and precious over our seeds. So there isn't actually a place out there yet who's offering them up for grabs at a certain cost. I think we're keeping them in situ, although there is an experiment that's going on in the Netherlands to do viability testing of seeds, really experimenting with how we can improve and increase the germination rate. So they're doing really controlled lab experiments, and that's the only occasion I've actually heard of us all donating seeds. But usually we're quite protective over them because they've taken so long to collect.
Yeah, I guess there's also the element of biosecurity as well, like I mentioned, in being able to move seeds a certain distance from where you've picked them. I think other projects have had issues as well with not being able to move seeds from Wales to England and things like that. So there is an element of that involved in it all as well.
What we're finding increasingly with all sorts of things, isn't it, that even though things are the same species, you have populations that are genetically tailored to a specific area, and it's evolved separately for over a long time. So seagrass that does well around Cornwall might not do so well elsewhere, exactly because it's just not adapted to those conditions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, and this is something. So with working with Nulltime and Mariner both intertidally, we have made the choice not to plant any Mariner near Nulltime or where we know there's Nulltime, because there isn't, just in case there's a competition and we plant Mariner at those sites and it overruns the Nulltime. So even within those sorts of areas, we're being really careful.
And then we've got Maya, who's asked, how long will the restoration project continue for?
And Chloe might be able to jump in here as well. It's like a year by year funded project. So every single year, it's whether we get more funding for it to continue. We'd love to be able to keep going and hopefully have some results this year and kind of scale up and end up with a really lovely, thriving intertidal seagrass meadow. Our kind of thoughts is, rather than doing, some projects go for scale, and so like project Ocean Conservation Trust will collect millions of seeds and hopefully try to restore hectares at a time, whereas we're more along the lines of trying to reintroduce seagrass to places it's been lost, and then hopefully it will kind of grow and expand on with our help from there. So yeah, I'm afraid can't really give a timeline on how long this project will run for. But yeah, we just hope for the foreseeable future.
Exactly, and the fact that restoration it's not a one and done kind of instantly restored in a year. It does take time of getting to know a site and introducing seeds and monitoring it. So it does take a little bit longer than just a year of planting and finished. But yeah, that's kind of the hope, is to keep it rolling for a fair bit longer, just so that the sites are self-sustaining and can expand and grow once we've introduced seeds to the areas.
Right. So Katie's asked, does algae have any benefits to the environment? So I can jump in there a bit if you like, and just say yes, definitely. I mean, a lot of all the life that we love out there in the sea, algae is the base of that food chain, and there's so many different types of algae. It's seaweed, basically. There's so many different types. So the green algae we were seeing there is really opportunistic, grows really quickly, but it also gets eaten by lots of stuff too. So in a natural situation, when we don't have too many nutrients, it's growing at a more controlled rate, really, but it's being eaten as quickly as it will grow. So it definitely has benefits. And, in some places, like seaweeds are vitally important habitats. So you think about kelp and stuff. It's all important stuff. It's just an indication of imbalance, basically, when we've got too much of something there. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that. That's my take on it.
I mean, I interestingly as well did I think I saw it in a different webinar that anything that's growing in that way is storing carbon in itself, and it's this idea. So seagrass doesn't store carbon so much in itself. It does to an extent in its leaves, but it's mostly in this process of trapping the sediment with its roots and kind of creating these lumps of mud, and that's what's storing any kind of carbon within it. And algae is also a source of carbon in that sense, of physical carbon. So if it was to get stored, then there's potential for carbon sequestration there. But generally, as you've seen, it kind of just starts to rot and turn. There's this rotting and anoxia that just means it's being redistributed back into the atmosphere. But yeah, there's an argument there that it is these huge carbon stores that that then could naturally store. I'm not sure. Don't know enough into all of that, but it's just I guess to be devil's advocate there.
Cool. And then finally, I've got a question from Eleanor that was just saying, is there any scope for making voluntary protection of seagrass legal or legally protected?
Yeah, I guess it's a hard one because obviously you've got the voluntary protection that comes from the marker buoys, I know, in the Helford, and I think maybe in St Austell Bay as well, if I'm not wrong. There to kind of make people from anchoring within the seagrass and causing that damage. But a lot of the issues we have for why the seagrass isn't doing so well is much bigger issues because of the water quality, kind of agricultural runoff. They're things that need to be addressed on scale and need much more kind of money funding, kind of farm advisory and that sort of thing to help deal with the problem. So it's, once the seagrass is growing, into a point, it's doing really, really well if the environment's right, but it's getting the environment into that condition in the first place. So our battle is more with that than protecting it once it's there. But for wider seagrass, I guess for subtidal, it would be amazing to have some of these areas formally protected. It's just how does that happen? That's kind of, I guess, beyond ours. But if anyone else wants to add into that, that's kind of beyond my remit.
We're interested in getting much more legal protection for all of our marine environment, really. So at the moment, so little of our subtidal habitats and intertidal habitats have got real legal protection. It's a very small proportion. I mean, 38% of UK waters, inshore waters, are under some sort of protective status, but in reality, not an awful amount of that is properly managed, and so the actual fraction it's more like 1% of our waters have actually got proper protection from damaging activities in them at the moment. So it's obviously something that we keep, there's many NGOs campaigning around that and trying to keep the pressure on to get more protection of all of our habitats. Well, that might be. Has anybody else got any questions? Feel free to, you can unmute and chip in if you'd like to. Have any questions for Justin or Nia or Chloe? Tom?
Hi, Bex. Good to see you all again. I've got a bit of feedback here, sorry. Where's the new area on the Helford? Just wondering where that says Bute.Veen. Obviously, we know the area very well.
If you go, so it's upstream of Port Navis. So really, it's on. Is it Anne Marie Creek? Is that what the locals call it?
Oh, right at the top. Right. Fantastic.
Yeah.
And how's it gone? Has it gone well, the planting?
The planting's gone well. Yeah, we've finished getting all the seeds in there, and we've done them at quite high density. So hopefully, we're getting them emerging. Sorry, the feedback's coming. Then it will all be established really close together. probably two of you joining in a room that does it. That's what happens with WhatsApp calls with me and my family.
That's better. Sorry about that. Um, and the one thing I noticed when we were looking at the seagrass areas as well was the Helford's mad because like it's in between Helford Passage and Helford Village where it's doing extremely well. It's like the busiest area of the waterway. And there's boats there left, right, and centre, but it seems to do particularly well. And I couldn't understand why that area would do so well when quieter areas, well, have failed obviously with the algae and other things.
Mm-hmm. Well, for those beds, they're more subtidal, aren't they? They've got a lot of water flushing over them. So even though we've got algae issues intertidally, it tends to be that when the tide's out, it all drops off and has kind of a blanketing effect over the intertidal area. So they are very much smothered when you've got all yeah. But for that stretch, I know that the water does run quite quick when it is high water, so that probably helps to really flush it of algae that could be kind of blocking the sunlight
That makes sense, yeah.
for the plants. That's my theory anyway. Yeah.
Thanks, Glenn.
It is quite interesting though, because also on the Tamar, the Tor Point site, it's quite a busy area as well, and the seagrass is doing really well there. So yeah, I'm not sure on. I don't have any theories on that, but just interesting to note, I guess, that yeah, it's doing really well in those sorts of areas.
I find that quite fascinating, of all the places for it to be doing well. We've got a question from Jack, who's just saying, how can they get involved with the volunteering?
Yeah, I guess, Bex, if we can also send out a link to our assemble, then people can sign up through that. So we generally, for our work, we're posting our sessions on Assemble, and hopefully we'll also get some of the initial ones onto Eventbrite. But you can sign up to be an actual Seagrass member on Assemble, and then you'll get notifications of when we put our events up. And we start generally looking for people to come and help us from sort of July onwards is properly kind of out on the beds collecting the seeds. Before that, we might do a little bit of monitoring, but yeah, kind of July through to November is when we're picking and planting. So a really good time to get involved. Generally doing the picking kind of 2 to 3 times a week down on the Tor Point beds. And then we will have the seed sorting and seed sitting again in Falmouth, which is another area to get involved in if you kind of, either can't get to the other sites or prefer to be on land. And then also a few of the planting days as well.
So we'll send if you send me details, I'll send that out with the follow-up email. Can't speak now, it's obviously got too late. I've also just put a link to our Cornwall Wildlife Trust volunteering page. So that posts up opportunities that come in. There's no seagrass ones live at the moment on that, but they will appear there, won't they, when you sort of like start
and I guess also if you're interested in any of Janet's work with the Action for Seagrass and Kelp, please just get in contact with us, and we can send you her email or put you in touch with her. Again, they're looking for volunteers around kind of St Austell Bay and also Mounts Bay, I believe. But look, they're open to expanding to other sites as well and exploring further. I think, and Justin is more involved in that, so he might be able to give more of a shout to that. But another cool thing to be getting involved with. And also Sea Search as well. That's a course that we run. Bex, you might be able to equally expand on this, but an opportunity to kind of get more involved in the surveying while snorkeling or diving, surveying for species, habitats, anything like that. And we can also use that data when it's over seagrass meadows and merle and kelp to be kind of adding into bigger data sets. I'm actually currently working on using the Sea Search data to send over to Natural England to help with their seagrass and merle mapping. So it really does come in handy with these things, having all the citizen science data within the trust.
Could I just add a sort of a tangent side to that, and also in terms of getting involved is don't underestimate the power of your voice. So, for example, here locally, St Austell Bay, there was proposals to install a desalination plant, and the local community really rallied very strongly against it. They got together, they collected all sorts of data, and it's really made things very, very difficult for the water treatment company to go ahead with that work. And there's instances of, we do hear a lot of unfortunate news about things being pushed ahead, but there are instances of where citizens of of a local environment have rallied together and made change. So in addition to volunteering, make yourself heard if there's a call or something that speaks to you.
Yeah, and I guess that leads really nicely into the Your Shore network we have at the Wildlife Trust, which is a series of like marine groups all across the Cornwall that you can get involved with, who are kind of working in the community, who are doing these amazing things. I know there's quite a few different examples like that Justin just mentioned, where the communities have really come together and done some amazing things. So please do have a look at what your local community group is and what they're up to and how you can get involved.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Justin, especially for stepping in first to the plate tonight. That was great and a really interesting, fascinating talk about your research. Thanks to Nia for talking about all of you and Chloe's and all your volunteers' fantastic work on the seagrass restoration. So we'll be looking out for updates now of new seagrass, which will be amazing. And thank you everyone for coming along and supporting us tonight. So it's lovely to see so many people here listening and getting involved and asking questions. So I think we'll close there. I'll say thank you very much and a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.